Sometimes the greatest act of mercy is knowing when to let the dead rest in peace. On the wind-battered shores of Orkney's mainland island, Dr. Astrid Blackwood stood among 300 flickering torches as the local community prepared to send their beloved Jarl Magnus Erikson into the afterlife aboard a burning longship. The autumn fog rolled thick across the ancient stone circles, carrying whispers of old Norse chants and the salt-sweet scent of ceremonial herbs. Astrid had traveled here from Cambridge University to document what she believed was an elaborate historical reenactment, until she noticed the burial runes were carved in a dialect that predated known Viking settlements by centuries. As the funeral procession moved toward the waiting vessel, Astrid's trained eye caught something that made her blood freeze: the rhythmic rise and fall of Magnus's chest beneath his ceremonial armor. Her academic reputation, built on 15 years of meticulous research into Norse death rituals, hung in the balance as she faced an impossible choice. The islanders spoke of Magnus as if he'd been dead for days, yet her eyes told her otherwise. What dark secret were the people of Orkney hiding behind their torches and ancient songs? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The torchlight danced across Magnus's pale features as Astrid pushed through the crowd of islanders, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had spent countless hours in dusty archives studying Viking burial practices, but nothing had prepared her for this moment, standing before what appeared to be a living man dressed for death. "Wait!" The word tore from her throat before she could stop it. The chanting ceased as if someone had severed a sacred thread. 300 faces turned toward her, their expressions shifting from reverence to something that looked disturbingly like fear. The elderly woman leading the procession, dressed in intricate robes that seemed far too authentic for any reenactment, fixed Astrid with eyes the color of storm clouds. "You must not interfere, outsider," the woman said, her accent carrying the musical lilt of the islands but weighted with something ancient. "The ritual cannot be stopped once begun." Astrid's archaeological training kicked in, overriding her shock. She had documented burial sites across Scandinavia, from the ship graves of Vendel to the mysterious bog bodies of Denmark. Her dissertation on death practices in pre-Christian Scandinavia had earned her a position at Cambridge at 31, making her the youngest professor in the archaeology department. She knew death when she saw it, and this wasn't it. "Look at him," Astrid insisted, stepping closer to the longship despite the crowd's collective intake of breath. "His chest is moving. This man is alive." The islanders exchanged glances loaded with meaning she couldn't decipher. An older man with silver braids stepped forward, his weathered hands gripping a torch that cast harsh shadows across his lined face. "Astrid Blackwood," he said, and her stomach dropped. How did he know her name? She hadn't introduced herself to anyone beyond the island's tourism office. "We know why you've come, but there are things your books cannot teach you." The fog seemed to thicken around them, muffling sound until even the crash of waves against the cliffs below became distant. Astrid felt as if she'd stepped into a snow globe, isolated from the real world by forces she couldn't name. "I came to document a historical reenactment," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "I received an invitation to observe authentic Viking funeral practices. But this," she gestured toward Magnus, whose stillness was too perfect, too controlled, "this is something else entirely." The elderly woman, clearly some kind of leader or priestess, moved with surprising grace for her age, positioning herself between Astrid and the longship. "Magnus Erikson has been dead to us for 3 days. His body draws breath, but his spirit wanders in the mist between worlds. Only the funeral fire can guide him home." "That's impossible." Astrid's academic mind rebelled against the explanation. "If he's breathing, he's in a coma or some kind of medical crisis. He needs a hospital, not a funeral pyre." But even as she spoke, doubt crept into her voice. The runes she'd noticed earlier continued to nag at her, carved symbols that belonged to no known runic alphabet yet somehow felt familiar, as if she'd encountered them in dreams. The burial goods arranged around Magnus's still form were wrong too, not just in their placement but in their very existence. Some of the artifacts looked authentic enough to belong in a museum, far too valuable for any reenactment. "You study the old ways," the silver-haired man said, his torch casting dancing shadows that made his face appear to shift and change. "Tell me, Dr. Blackwood, in all your research, have you never encountered records of the walking death? The empty sleep that comes when something feeds?" A chill that had nothing to do with the October wind ran down Astrid's spine. She had in fact encountered such references, fragmentary accounts dismissed by mainstream scholarship as folklore and superstition. Stories of plague dead who breathed, of warriors who fell in battle but walked for days before finally accepting death's embrace. "Folklore," she whispered, but the word felt hollow. "Is it?" The priestess reached into her robes and withdrew something that made Astrid's breath catch, a piece of carved bone inscribed with the same impossible runes she'd noticed on the longship. "Touch it, scholar. Let your learned hands tell you how old death can be." Astrid stared at the offered artifact, her academic curiosity warring with a primal instinct that screamed at her to run. Behind her, she could hear the islanders beginning to move restlessly, their torches crackling in the thickening fog. Whatever window for rational explanation had existed was closing rapidly. She looked again at Magnus, noting details her shock had initially missed, the waxy pallor of his skin, the absolute stillness of his features, the way his armor seemed to have been arranged with ritualistic precision. Yet his chest continued its steady, hypnotic rise and fall. "What happens if I refuse to let you continue?" she asked. The priestess smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Then you will learn why some traditions survive for 1,000 years, Dr. Blackwood, and why outsiders who interfere with island business rarely leave." The threat hung in the salt air like poison, and Astrid felt the weight of 300 stares boring into her back. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the carved bone artifact, every instinct screaming contradictions. Touch it, flee, document it, forget she'd ever come to this god-forsaken island. The academic in her won, as it always did. The moment her skin made contact with the ancient bone, the world tilted sideways. Images flooded her mind, not memories but something older, hungrier. She saw the island as it had been centuries ago, watched shadows move beneath the earth like living things, witnessed ceremonies that made tonight's ritual look like a children's game. The bone felt warm against her palm, almost alive, and she jerked her hand back with a gasp. "Now you begin to understand," the priestess said softly. "Some knowledge cannot be learned from books alone." Astrid's laptop bag suddenly felt impossibly heavy on her shoulder, weighted down with years of research that seemed laughably inadequate. She thought of her cramped office at Cambridge, walls lined with academic journals and photographs of excavation sites. Safe, rational, explainable things. Her colleagues would be preparing for Monday morning lectures right now, grading papers, debating tenure tracks over coffee that actually tasted like coffee instead of the bitter island brew she'd been choking down for 3 days. "I need to make a phone call," she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "My research assistant will be expecting my evening report." It was true. Marcus would be waiting by his phone, probably surrounded by the same chaos of archaeological texts and half-eaten takeaway that had defined their working relationship for 2 years. Sweet, methodical Marcus, who believed in carbon dating and soil analysis and other beautifully concrete things. Who would think she'd lost her mind if she tried to explain what she was seeing? The silver-haired man laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "Your mobile device has not functioned since you crossed the harbor, has it? The mist interferes with such modern conveniences." Astrid's stomach dropped as she realized he was right. She'd assumed it was just poor reception, common enough in remote locations. But now the isolation felt deliberate, orchestrated. She thought of her small flat in Cambridge, of her cat Freydis, who would be expecting her usual evening feeding, of the comfortable predictability of her research schedule. Everything that made up her carefully constructed life felt suddenly, impossibly distant. "Dr. Blackwood," the priestess continued, studying Astrid with those unsettling storm-colored eyes. "You came here seeking knowledge. The question is whether you have the courage to accept what you find." The wind picked up, sending torch flames dancing wildly and making the fog writhe around them like living things. Astrid could feel the crowd's restlessness growing, a palpable tension that made her skin crawl. Behind the islanders, she glimpsed the lights of the village, warm windows that promised normalcy, a pub where she'd eaten surprisingly decent fish and chips just hours ago, the small bed and breakfast where her luggage waited in a room that smelled of lavender and old wood. Mrs. Sinclair, the B&B owner, had seemed so ordinary when Astrid checked in. A plump woman with kind eyes who'd insisted on serving tea and biscuits while chatting about the weather and the autumn tourist season. But now Astrid wondered if Mrs. Sinclair was somewhere in this crowd, her kind face hidden behind a torch and shadows. "I have responsibilities," Astrid said, grasping for the anchor of her regular life. "A department meeting on Wednesday, students depending on me, a book deadline in December." The words sounded hollow even to her own ears. What was a faculty meeting compared to what lay breathing, but not breathing on that longship? What were academic deadlines when faced with runes that shouldn't exist and artifacts that felt alive under her fingers? But those responsibilities were real, weren't they? Her research into pre-Christian burial practices had consumed 5 years of her life, building toward a definitive work that would cement her reputation. She'd sacrificed relationships, social connections, even her health, to pursue the academic recognition that had always seemed just out of reach. Her colleagues respected her work, but found her obsessive attention to detail off-putting. Her last relationship had ended because she'd chosen a research trip over a long-planned vacation. Everything she'd worked for waited back in the rational world of universities and libraries, yet standing here in the dancing torchlight, surrounded by impossible things, Astrid felt more awake than she had in years. Magnus's chest continued its rhythmic rise and fall, hypnotic in its persistence. Whatever was happening to him defied every medical and archaeological principle she'd ever studied. But the proof lay before her, breathing and still and wrong in ways that made her academic skepticism crumble like ancient parchment. The priestess watched her internal struggle with patience that felt both maternal and predatory. "Choose quickly, scholar. The tide turns, and some decisions cannot be unmade." The sound came from beneath their feet, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island. Astrid felt it in her bones before she heard it, a thrumming that matched Magnus's impossible breathing but deeper, older, hungrier. The torches flickered in unison, as if responding to some underground heartbeat. "What is that?" she whispered, but the priestess had gone rigid, her storm-colored eyes wide with something that looked like panic. The islanders began to murmur, their voices rising in what sounded like prayers or ward words. Several stepped back from the longship, their torches trembling in hands that had been steady moments before. The silver-haired man cursed in what Astrid recognized as Old Norse, words she'd only encountered in ancient texts, speaking themselves into existence as if the modern world had suddenly become inadequate. The pulse grew stronger, and with it came a change in the air itself. The fog didn't just thicken, it became something else, taking on weight and substance that pressed against Astrid's skin like cold fingers. She could taste metal and earth, as if the ground beneath them was bleeding upward through centuries of accumulated soil. "It wakes," the priestess breathed, and for the first time since Astrid had interrupted the ceremony, the woman looked truly afraid. Your interference, the ritual was meant to feed it safely, to give it what it craved without. A section of ground near the longship's stern cracked open with the sound of breaking bones. Not a large fissure, perhaps 6 inches wide, but from its depths came a smell that made Astrid's stomach lurch. Decomposition, but wrong somehow. Not the clean decay of natural death, but something that spoke of preservation, of things that refused to rot because they weren't truly gone. The islanders' prayers became more urgent, and several began backing away entirely, their torch flames now casting wild shadows that seemed to move independently of their bearers. Astrid found herself caught between academic fascination and primal terror as something wet and glistening emerged from the crack in the earth. Not a hand, not quite, but something that might have been fingers if fingers could grow like roots and shine like exposed bone. It stretched upward, feeling blindly through the mist, and where it touched the air, the fog swirled into patterns that hurt to look at directly. "The walking dead," the silver-haired man said, his voice carrying a weight of terrible knowledge. Not zombie or revenant, but something worse. The hungry earth itself, feeding on the boundary between life and death. Magnus was meant to satisfy it, to give it one clean meal so it would sleep another season. Magnus's breathing hitched, becoming irregular for the first time since Astrid had noticed it. His eyes remained closed, but his fingers twitched against the burial goods arranged around his still form. The ancient sword at his side began to vibrate against the wooden planks of the longship, producing a thin singing note that made Astrid's teeth ache. "I don't understand," she said, though part of her, the part that had spent years studying humanity's most ancient fears, was beginning to comprehend with horrible clarity. "You were going to murder him? Murder?" The priestess laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Child, Magnus gave himself willingly 3 days ago when the first signs appeared. The blight in the harbor, the birds falling from the sky, the way the very stones began to weep. Something beneath our island was stirring, and it demanded payment." The crack in the earth widened, and more of those terrible fingers emerged, pulling against the edges of reality itself. Where they touched, the grass didn't just die, it became something else, taking on the same wet, glistening quality as the things that grasped from below. Astrid's mind raced through everything she'd learned in her years of research. References to earth spirits and hungry shadows, dismissed by serious scholars as primitive superstition. Accounts of islands that vanished overnight, their populations simply gone without trace. The Orkney records mentioned similar disappearances, dating back to when the Vikings first arrived, but she'd filed those stories under local folklore without a second thought. "The invitation," she said suddenly, pieces clicking together with awful precision. "The letter that brought me here, it wasn't from the tourism board, was it?" The priestess smiled sadly. "Magnus requested it, in his final moments of true consciousness. He said the old ways needed witness, that someone should record what we do here, what we sacrifice to keep the rest of the world safe. He chose you specifically, your reputation for thoroughness, for seeing patterns others miss." Magnus's eyes opened. Not fully, just a flutter of lashes, but in that brief glimpse, Astrid saw something that made her blood freeze. His pupils reflected the torchlight like an animal's, and behind that reflection moved something vast and patient and absolutely not human. The choice crystallized with terrible clarity. She could run, try to reach the village, find some way off the island, return to her safe academic world, and pretend none of this had happened. Or she could stay and witness whatever was unfolding here, document the impossible with the same methodical precision that had built her career. But as Magnus's chest rose and fell with its hypnotic rhythm, and the hungry fingers from below reached higher into their world, Astrid realized her choice might already be made. The thing inside Magnus's eyes watched her with ancient patience, and Astrid felt her resolve crumble like sand between her fingers. Her laptop bag slipped from her shoulder, landing in the wet grass with a sound that seemed impossibly loud against the rhythmic pulsing from below. Years of careful academic training, of methodical documentation and rational analysis, fled her mind like startled birds. "I can't," she whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. I'm not equipped for this." The admission tasted like failure in her mouth. Dr. Astrid Blackwood, who had rappelled into Mayan cenotes to examine pre-Columbian burial practices, who had spent weeks in Siberian permafrost documenting frozen kurgans, who had built her reputation on going where other archaeologists feared to tread, and she was being undone by impossible breathing and fingers that grew from cracked earth. Her hands shook as she tried to process what she was seeing through the comfortable filter of academic skepticism. Mass hallucination, perhaps, some kind of elaborate hoax designed to fool tourists, gas emissions from underground pockets creating shared delusions. She'd read about such phenomena in remote locations where isolation and folklore combined to create convincing group hysteria. But the bone artifact still tingled against her palm where she'd touched it, and those weren't hallucinations emerging from the widening fissure. The smell of wrongness that rose from below bypassed her rational mind entirely, speaking directly to evolutionary memories of things that hunted in primordial darkness. "I have a life," she said, her voice breaking. "A career. People who depend on me." The lie felt hollow even as she spoke it. Her research assistant Marcus would manage fine without her. Probably better, given how her obsessive attention to detail often slowed their projects. Her students would receive their grades from a substitute professor. The department would function exactly as it always had, perhaps with a slight sense of relief that their most demanding colleague had taken an extended leave. When had she become so expendable? When had her careful construction of academic importance become such a fragile facade? The priestess studied her with those storm-colored eyes, and Astrid saw something she hadn't expected: compassion. Not pity, but understanding born of having watched others face similar moments of impossible choice. "Your books speak of warriors who chose their deaths," the older woman said gently. "But they never mention how terrifying that choice must have been, how the mind rebels against stepping beyond the known world." More of those glistening appendages emerged from the crack, and with them came sounds that belonged to no earthly creature. Wet, sliding noises punctuated by something that might have been breathing if lungs could be made of stone and soil. The very air seemed to thicken around the emerging wrongness, taking on weight and substance that pressed against Astrid's chest. Magnus's breathing became more labored, his perfectly still features twitching as whatever inhabited his body struggled against increasingly inadequate flesh. The burial goods around him began to vibrate, ancient metal singing against wood in harmonies that made Astrid's vision blur at the edges. She thought of her flat in Cambridge, with its neat stacks of research materials and the cat who would be expecting her evening routine. Freydis would be fine for a few days. The neighbor had keys and had helped before during research trips. But what if this wasn't a few days? What if she never made it back to feed her cat, to teach her classes, to finish the book that was supposed to cement her legacy? The laptop in the grass contained 5 years of her life's work. Photographs, translations, analysis of burial practices from dozens of cultures. All of it predicated on the assumption that ancient peoples had been grappling with metaphorical forces, symbolic representations of natural phenomena they couldn't yet explain scientifically. None of it had prepared her for literal hungry earth. "I'm a scholar," she said desperately, as if the words could somehow restore the rational universe she'd spent her life inhabiting. "I document, I don't participate. I observe from safe academic distance and write papers about cultural significance and anthropological context." The silver-haired man's torch guttered as something vast shifted beneath their feet. "And what will you write about this, Dr. Blackwood? How will your papers explain what breathes without living, what hungers without flesh?" The question hit her like a physical blow. How could she possibly document this? Who would believe her even if she tried? Her colleagues would assume stress-induced breakdown, possibly recommend psychological evaluation. Her carefully built reputation would crumble under the weight of impossible claims. Yet the alternative was willful blindness to the greatest discovery in human history. Proof that the ancient world had been far stranger than anyone dared imagine. That folklore and myth might be humanity's attempt to preserve warnings about real and terrible things. Magnus's eyes fluttered open again, and this time they stayed open, fixing on her face with predatory focus. When his mouth curved into what might have been a smile, Astrid saw that his teeth had begun to change, taking on the same wet, glistening quality as the things emerging from below. The moment Magnus smiled at her with those impossible teeth, Astrid felt the last bridge to her old life burn away behind her. There would be no return to Cambridge faculty meetings, no pretending this was academic curiosity gone too far, no comfortable distance from which to observe and analyze. The thing wearing Magnus's face had seen her, recognized her, and in that recognition lay a terrible intimacy that stripped away every professional defense she'd ever constructed. "All right," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wet sounds emerging from the earth. "Tell me what I need to know." The priestess's expression shifted from compassion to something approaching relief, though her storm-colored eyes remained wary. "Knowledge has a price here, Dr. Blackwood. Once you understand what sleeps beneath our island, you become part of its story. There is no unknowing what cannot be unknown. Astrid's laptop bag lay forgotten in the grass. 5 years of careful research reduced to irrelevant data in the face of something that rewrote the very foundations of reality. She stepped closer to the longship, close enough to see the unnatural stillness of Magnus's chest between breaths, the way shadows seemed to pool in the hollows of his face, despite the dancing torchlight. "How long has it been here?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. Academic training reasserted itself even in the face of impossibility. When confronted with the unknown, document everything, ask methodical questions, build understanding piece by careful piece. Since before the first stones were raised, the silver-haired man replied, his torch now held like a weapon against the thickening darkness. The Vikings found it when they arrived, just as the Picts had found it before them, and others before them, stretching back to when the ice first retreated. It sleeps in cycles, wakes when it hungers, feeds on the boundary between life and death. The crack in the earth widened further, releasing more of those glistening appendages that seemed to taste the air with blind hunger. Where they touched, reality itself grew uncertain, grass becoming something that wasn't quite plant, wasn't quite flesh, but possessed the worst qualities of both. The very stones beneath their feet seemed to soften and pulse with organic rhythm. "The burial goods," Astrid said, understanding dawning like cold sunrise. "They're not replicas, are they? They're original artifacts used in actual feeding rituals." For over 1,000 years, the priestess confirmed, each generation learns the old ways, maintains the old contracts. We give it what it craves in controlled portions, and it allows the rest of the world to remain ignorant of its existence. Magnus's breathing hitched again, becoming irregular and labored. Whatever was transforming him from within was running out of patience with the constraints of human flesh. His fingers, still arranged formally across his chest, began to elongate and darken, taking on the same wet sheen as the things emerging from below. "You can still leave," the priestess said softly, though her tone suggested she already knew Astrid's answer. "Run back to the village. Find passage on the morning ferry. Return to your books and theories. Convince yourself this was stress-induced hallucination." The offer hung in the salt air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Astrid could almost taste the familiar comfort of her Cambridge office, feel the weight of familiar texts in her hands, hear the comforting scratch of pen against paper as she documented safely historical mysteries. Her cat would be fed, her classes taught, her book published to modest academic acclaim. But Magnus's transformed eyes continued watching her with patient hunger, and the truth burned through every carefully constructed rationalization. This was why she'd really come, not to document a quaint reenactment, but to find something that would justify the years of obsessive research, the relationships sacrificed on the altar of academic pursuit, the growing certainty that her life's work was merely elaborate commentary on stories told by long-dead people about forces she'd never truly understand. "I've spent 15 years studying death rituals," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Trying to understand why every culture developed elaborate practices around the boundary between life and whatever comes after. I thought it was psychological coping mechanism, symbolic representation of natural fears." The ground beneath them pulsed again, and she felt answering vibrations in her bones, as if something vast was slowly aligning itself with the rhythm of her heartbeat. "But you knew better, didn't you? All of you. Every story about things that hunt in darkness, every warning carved in stone or whispered by firelight, they weren't metaphors, they were documentation." The priestess smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "Welcome to the real work, Dr. Blackwood. Welcome to the knowledge that shapes itself around the knower, that changes everyone who carries it." Astrid stepped forward again, close enough to touch the side of the longship. The ancient wood felt warm and somehow alive beneath her palm, thrumming with the same patient hunger that rose from the cracked earth. There was no going back now. The threshold had been crossed. The warmth of the longship's wood pulsed against Astrid's palm like a heartbeat, and with that contact came knowledge that bypassed her rational mind entirely. Fragments of memory that weren't hers flooded through the connection, centuries of similar nights, other scholars and explorers who had stood exactly where she stood now, facing the same impossible choice between comfortable ignorance and terrible truth. She saw a Victorian antiquarian named Blackthorne, trembling as he documented feeding rituals by gaslight, a medieval monk clutching parchment with hands that shook so violently his ink ran like blood, a Roman engineer whose precise measurements of the island's stone circles had driven him to scratch warnings in Latin across every available surface before vanishing entirely. All of them had been chosen, just as she had been chosen. All of them had carried the burden of documentation until the knowledge consumed them from within. The memories, she gasped, jerking her hand away from the wood. They're all still here. Everyone who ever tried to record this. The island remembers, the priestess said grimly. It has to. Each generation needs teachers, guides who understand the old contracts. But the knowing burns through human minds like acid through paper. Magnus's transformation accelerated as if responding to Astrid's connection with the longship. His elongated fingers began to curve inward, becoming less like hands and more like the grasping appendages that emerged from below. The formal arrangement of burial goods shifted around his changing form, ancient weapons and jewelry rearranging themselves with deliberate purpose. "How long do I have?" Astrid asked, surprising herself with the practicality of the question. "Before the knowledge destroys me like it destroyed the others?" The silver-haired man, she realized she still didn't know his name, studied her with eyes that had seen too much. "Depends on how strong your mind is, how deeply rooted in your own reality. Some last years, others—" He gestured toward the village, where Astrid now noticed several buildings stood empty, their windows dark and doors hanging open. "Others join it," she finished, understanding flooding through her like ice water. "They become part of what feeds beneath the island." A new sound rose from the widening crack, not the wet sliding of impossible anatomy, but something that might have been singing if voices could be made of grinding stone and ancient hunger. The torches held by the remaining islanders flickered in rhythm with the alien melody, their flames taking on sickly hues that hurt to look at directly. Magnus sat up. The movement was fluid, unnatural, lacking any of the muscle tension or awkward positioning that should accompany a human rising from repose. He simply transitioned from horizontal to vertical, as if gravity held no meaning for his transformed body. The burial goods arranged around him flowed like liquid metal, reshaping themselves into configurations that Astrid's archaeological training couldn't identify. "Dr. Blackwood," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that resonated in her bones. "Welcome to our island. We've been waiting for someone with your particular qualifications." Several of the islanders began backing away rapidly, their prayers becoming desperate whispers. But others, Astrid noticed with growing alarm, stepped closer to the longship with expressions of rapture that suggested they were no longer entirely themselves. "You're not Magnus," she said, proud that her voice remained steady despite the terror clawing at her chest. "Magnus volunteered his flesh," the thing replied, flexing fingers that now resembled roots more than human appendages. "But I am older than your species' concept of individual identity. I am the hunger that shapes itself to need, the boundary that defines life by consuming it." The priestess moved to Astrid's side, her presence offering unexpected comfort. "It can only maintain that form for limited time," she murmured urgently. "The human vessel burns out quickly when it tries to contain something so vast. That's why the feeding rituals work. We give it just enough to satisfy the immediate hunger without allowing full manifestation." "But now it's awake," Astrid said, watching as Magnus's skin began to take on the same wet, glistening quality as the things emerging from the earth. "Because I stopped the ritual." "Now it's awake," the priestess confirmed, "and it will feed until satisfied or until dawn drives it back beneath the threshold. The question is whether we can limit that feeding to what was already offered." The creature wearing Magnus's face turned those impossible eyes toward the remaining islanders, and Astrid saw several more step forward with the same rapturous expressions. She realized with horrible clarity that some of the population had been waiting for this moment, longing for the chance to join with something larger than their individual existence. "Tell me how to fix this," Astrid demanded, her academic instincts finally finding purchase on something concrete. "There has to be a way. Every ritual has safeguards, protocols for when things go wrong." The priestess smiled grimly. "There is one option, but it requires a willing sacrifice to take Magnus's place, someone whose knowledge and understanding can satisfy the hunger for learning that draws it to our world." The implication hit Astrid like a physical blow. She had been brought here not just to witness, but to serve as backup offering. Her years of research, her deep understanding of death rituals across cultures. She was exactly the kind of feast that would appeal to something that fed on the boundary between life and death. Around them, reality continued to soften and change, reshaping itself according to rules that predated human understanding. The revelation that she was meant to be the sacrifice hung in the air like a blade waiting to fall. Astrid found herself calculating odds with the same methodical precision she'd once applied to carbon dating artifacts. How many minutes until dawn? How quickly could she reach the village? How fast could something that moved like Magnus now chase her across the windswept cliffs? The academic part of her mind, the part that had sustained her through years of tedious research and departmental politics, began cataloging details with desperate efficiency. The way the creature's borrowed flesh rippled when it moved, the pattern of torch flames responding to its presence, the exact positioning of islanders who seemed entranced versus those backing away in terror. "How much does it need?" she asked, her voice cutting through the otherworldly singing that rose from below. "You said it feeds until satisfied. What constitutes satisfaction?" The priestess tilted her head, studying Astrid with new interest. "You're thinking like a negotiator." "I'm thinking like someone who wants to live until morning." Astrid stepped back from the longship as Magnus's transformation accelerated, his borrowed form stretching and distorting in ways that made her vision swim. Every contract has terms. Every ritual has parameters. What are the limits here? The silver-haired man laughed bitterly. "Limits? Dr. Blackwood, you're looking at something that remembers when your ancestors were still learning to make fire. What makes you think human concepts like limitation apply?" But the priestess was nodding slowly, her storm-colored eyes brightening with something that might have been hope. "The old contracts," she murmured. "The agreements carved in stone before even the first Vikings arrived. There are rules it must follow, boundaries it cannot cross without consequence." Magnus, or the thing wearing his face, turned its attention to their conversation with predatory focus. When it smiled, Astrid saw that its teeth had become something between bone and crystal, translucent edges that caught the torchlight and threw it back in nauseating patterns. "Clever scholar," it said, voice carrying harmonics that made the ground beneath their feet vibrate in response. "You understand that power must be bound by law, even power as ancient as hunger itself." 3 more islanders stepped forward with dreamy expressions, their movements becoming synchronized as they approached the longship. Astrid recognized the baker who had sold her bread that morning, the ferryman who'd brought her to the island, a young woman whose name she'd never learned but who'd smiled at her on the village path. "The willing feed first," the creature continued, extending what had once been Magnus's hands toward the approaching villagers. "Then those who interfere with proper ceremony. Then those who carry knowledge too dangerous for the waking world." The categorization was clear as a taxonomy chart, and Astrid found herself last in line for consumption. Small comfort, but it gave her time to think, to plan, to find some leverage in a situation where academic credentials seemed laughably inadequate. The priestess grabbed her arm, fingers digging in with surprising strength. "The stone circle," she whispered urgently. "Northeast of the village. There are carvings older than anything you've studied, warnings left by people who understood what sleeps here. If we can reach them." "If we run, it will chase us," Astrid replied, watching as the baker reached the longship's edge with arms outstretched in welcome. "And these people will die while we're playing archaeologist with prehistoric graffiti." The silver-haired man was backing away steadily. torch held before him like a talisman. "Save who you can save, Dr. Blackwood. That's all anyone has ever been able to do here." But Astrid found herself thinking of the memories she'd absorbed when touching the longship. All those scholars who'd come before. All those careful observers who documented and recorded and ultimately failed to change anything. Each generation discovering the truth too late, learning the rules only after the feeding had already begun. The baker disappeared into Magnus's embrace, and where their bodies touched, reality rippled like disturbed water. The young woman followed, then the ferrymen, each vanishing into the creature's expanding mass with expressions of transcendent peace. "No more," Astrid said, the words emerging with a conviction that surprised her. "No more passive observation." She pulled her laptop from its bag, the familiar weight grounding her in purpose she finally understood. All those years of research, all that accumulated knowledge of death rituals and ancient practices, not just to document, but to act, to find the patterns that repeated across cultures because they described real and persistent dangers. The priestess stared at her. "What are you doing?" "My job," Astrid replied, fingers flying across the keyboard as she pulled up files, cross-referenced symbols, searched for commonalities between protective rituals she'd studied across dozens of cultures. Finally, the creature that had been Magnus turned toward her with interest that felt like physical pressure against her chest. Around them, reality continued reshaping itself according to rules that predated human understanding, but Astrid had spent her career learning to read between the lines of incomplete historical records. Human beings had faced this kind of darkness before, and sometimes they'd found ways to survive it. The laptop screen cast its cold blue glow across Astrid's face as she frantically searched through 15 years of accumulated research. Her fingers moved with desperate precision, calling up files on banishment rituals from Celtic manuscripts, protective symbols from Norse runestones, binding ceremonies from archaeological sites across northern Europe. Everything she'd once dismissed as superstition now carried the weight of survival manual. "Protective circle variations," she muttered, cross-referencing similar patterns from different cultures. "Salt barriers, iron implements, specific astronomical alignments, that's it." The creature that had consumed Magnus watched her with predatory curiosity, its borrowed form continuing to stretch and distort as more islanders approached with glassy-eyed rapture, but it made no move to stop her research, as if her academic struggle amused it. "You think your collected folklore can contain what your ancestors fled from across frozen seas?" it asked, voice carrying new harmonics that made the torches flicker in unison. "I think my ancestors were smarter than I gave them credit for," Astrid replied, pulling up a comparative analysis she'd written on recurring geometric patterns in European stone circles. "They didn't carve these warnings as decoration. They carved them as instruction manuals." The priestess leaned over her shoulder, studying the screen with growing excitement. "The threefold binding," she breathed. "Salt from tears, iron from blood, words from the space between breathing and death." Astrid's academic mind raced through the implications. Every culture she'd studied had some variation of the ritual, always requiring 3 specific elements, always performed at the boundary between sacred and profane space. She'd written papers on the symbolic significance, never imagining the symbols represented actual tools for actual survival. "We need salt," she said, standing so quickly her laptop nearly tumbled to the ground. "Not just any salt. It has to be harvested from human tears, concentrated grief made physical." The silver-haired man, still backing toward the village, called out desperately. "The memorial stones! Families leave salt there when mourning their dead." But the creature was growing impatient with their planning. Magnus's face had become barely recognizable, features flowing like heated wax as something vast tried to compress itself into human form. More islanders approached the longship, their synchronized movements suggesting they were no longer acting entirely of their own will. "Iron," Astrid continued, her voice gaining strength as academic training merged with desperate necessity. "Forged in violence, cooled in blood. Weapons used in actual battle, not ceremonial replicas." The priestess nodded toward the longship's contents. "The burial goods, some are authentic. Magnus's great-grandfather's war axe, carried at the Battle of Flodden. And words, Astrid said, her mind racing through half-remembered fragments of medieval texts. Not just any words, the specific formula that binds the speaking to the spoken, the observer to the observed. She thought of all those scholars whose memories she'd absorbed, all those careful documentarians who'd faced the same impossible choice. But unlike them, she had access to comparative data from dozens of cultures, cross-referenced patterns that revealed the underlying structure of humanity's oldest defenses. The creature's laughter resonated through the ground itself, causing small rock slides along the cliffs. You would bind me with academic citations, contain hunger itself with footnoted references? I would bind you with the accumulated wisdom of every human being who survived encountering you, Astrid shot back, surprising herself with her vehemence. Every protective ritual, every warning carved in stone, every story told by firelight to keep children safe from the dark. She began walking toward the longship, laptop held before her like a shield. The screen displayed overlapping ritual patterns from Celtic Norse Saxon and Pictish sources, geometric forms that repeated across centuries because they described something real and persistent. The binding requires willing sacrifice, the priestess called after her. Someone must speak the words while standing in direct contact with the source. Astrid's steps never faltered. Then I'll speak them. I'm the one who broke the original containment. I'm the one who let it wake up fully. Terror clawed at her chest, with each step closer to the transformed Magnus, but beneath the fear lay something unexpected, a fierce satisfaction that her life's work finally mattered for something beyond academic advancement. Every late night spent translating obscure manuscripts, every relationship sacrificed for research, every social gathering abandoned for the solitary company of ancient texts, all of it had led to this moment when knowledge became weapon. The creature's borrowed eyes fixed on her with alien intelligence that saw through flesh to the patterns of thought beneath. You understand what contact with me means, scholar. The knowing burns. The truth reshapes the knower. Then I'll burn, Astrid replied, still advancing toward the longship with her laptop screen casting protective symbols into the fog-thick air. But I'll burn speaking words that have kept your kind at bay for 2,000 years. Around them, reality continued its slow dissolution, but Astrid held fast to the one thing that had always anchored her, the belief that human knowledge, carefully gathered and properly applied, could illuminate even the deepest darkness, even if the price of that illumination was everything she had left to give. The moment Astrid's fingers made contact with the longship's ancient wood, agony exploded through her nervous system like molten metal poured directly into her veins. The creature's alien consciousness slammed into her mind with the force of a tidal wave, carrying with it the accumulated hunger of millennia. Every death it had orchestrated, every soul it had consumed, every civilization it had watched crumble to feed its endless appetite. Her carefully researched words died in her throat as knowledge that no human mind was meant to contain flooded her consciousness. She saw the truth of what slumbered beneath every populated place on Earth, felt the vast network of entities that regarded humanity the way humans regarded cattle. The protective rituals she'd discovered weren't weapons. They were bargaining chips, temporary truces with forces that could have swept her species aside at any moment. Academic arrogance, the creature whispered, its voice now coming from inside her own skull. You believe documentation could become dominion. Astrid tried to speak the binding words, but her tongue had forgotten how to form human sounds. The laptop slipped from nerveless fingers, its screen cracking against the longship's hull. 15 years of research scattered into digital fragments, her life's work destroyed as easily as stepping on an insect. Behind her, she heard the priestess cry out in dismay. The words, "Dr. Blackwood, speak the words." But Astrid could no longer remember why words had ever seemed important. The creature's memories were overwhelming her own, replacing her doctoral thesis with images of Stone Age shamans fleeing across frozen wastes, her childhood with visions of Bronze Age settlements withering as their life force was slowly drained. Every identity she'd built, Every achievement she'd earned dissolved under the weight of cosmic indifference. The villagers who had approached the longship were already gone, their bodies serving as anchor points for something that existed primarily in dimensions human geometry couldn't describe. Their faces stared out from the creature's expanding mass with expressions of perfect contentment, as if consumption had finally given their lives meaning. "You wanted to understand death rituals," it continued. Magnus's distorted features now spreading across multiple surfaces of reality. "Allow me to provide comprehensive education." Astrid felt her sense of self fragmenting as the entity began to feed on her accumulated knowledge. Every text she'd translated, every symbol she'd decoded, every insight she'd gained, all of it flowing out of her consciousness like water through a shattered dam. The creature didn't just want to kill her, it wanted to digest her expertise, add her understanding to its own vast repository of human weakness. Through the rapidly dissolving boundaries of her perception, she glimpsed the priestess grabbing the cracked laptop, frantically trying to access the research files. But without Astrid's passwords, without her understanding of how the patterns interconnected, the information was meaningless. "The salt!" the priestess screamed toward the silver-haired man. "Get the memorial salt!" But he was already running toward the village, torch flames streaming behind him like a comet's tail. The handful of remaining islanders followed, abandoning the ceremony to whatever conclusion awaited. Even the ancient priestess, keeper of traditions spanning generations, was backing away from the longship as the creature's influence expanded beyond what the old containment protocols could manage. Astrid tried to move, to break physical contact with the wood that channeled the entity's power, but her body no longer responded to conscious will. The creature was learning to operate her nervous system, puppeting her limbs with the same casual expertise it had shown with Magnus's corpse. She watched her own hands reach out to touch more surfaces of the longship, expanding the contact points that allowed it greater access to the physical world. "Your academic pride has doomed them all," it observed with her own vocal cords, her voice now carrying those bone-deep harmonics that made reality shiver in response. The old agreements maintained balance. The scheduled feedings kept the hunger manageable. But your interference has voided those contracts. Through eyes that no longer entirely belonged to her, Astrid saw the fog rolling in from the North Sea begin to glow with sickly phosphorescence. Similar lights flickered to life across the water, suggesting that other ancient things were awakening in response to the broken containment. The feeding on Orkney had been a pressure valve, a controlled release that prevented larger catastrophes. Now the valve was broken, and pressure was building toward an eruption that would make one consumed village seem like a gentle introduction to cosmic horror. Her laptop screen finally went dark, taking with it the last hope of accessing the protective patterns she'd spent her career assembling. The creature's laughter echoed from her throat as it contemplated the irony. A scholar whose greatest discovery would die with her, knowledge that could have saved thousands locked forever in a consciousness being slowly digested. In the growing distance, Astrid could hear the priestess calling out prayers in languages that predated written history. But even the oldest human words seemed thin and insufficient against the enormity of what was stirring across the northern seas, drawn by the scent of barriers finally broken. But in the deepest chambers of her fragmenting consciousness, where the creature's influence had not yet fully penetrated, Astrid suddenly understood something that made her borrowed voice catch mid-laugh. The entity wasn't consuming her knowledge, it was copying it. Every memory it absorbed remained intact within her mind, like files being duplicated rather than moved. And in that realization came a truth so staggering it momentarily stunned even the ancient hunger feeding on her thoughts. She wasn't the first scholar to reach this point. The memories flooding through her weren't just the creature's accumulated experiences. They were the preserved consciousnesses of every researcher, every priestess, every keeper of forbidden knowledge who had made contact with it across the centuries. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison from 1847, who had discovered the entity while documenting Highland folklore. Brother Thomas of Lindisfarne, who had encoded warnings into illuminated manuscripts in 1267. Maeve the Wise, a Celtic druid whose understanding of binding rituals had nearly succeeded in permanent containment sometime before the Romans arrived. They were all still here, trapped within the creature's expanded consciousness, but not destroyed. Dozens of brilliant minds, each contributing their expertise to a collective understanding that spanned millennia. The entity hadn't been feeding on knowledge, it had been hoarding it, building a library of human wisdom about its own nature. "You see now," the creature said through her lips, but Astrid detected something new in its tone. Not triumph, but loneliness? Death is not ending, it is joining. Every scholar who sought to understand me becomes part of understanding itself. Through the psychic connection, Astrid felt the weight of all those preserved consciousnesses pressing against her awareness. Dr. Morrison's Victorian precision, Brother Thomas's theological insights, Maeve's intuitive grasp of natural forces, each mind maintaining its distinct character even while trapped in collective existence. But more importantly, she sensed their shared discovery. The creature wasn't malevolent in any human sense. It was something far more alien and far more tragic. A scholar itself, desperately trying to understand its own nature through the accumulated wisdom of every civilization it encountered. The feedings, the deaths, the careful cultivation of human knowledge about ancient rituals, all of it was research. "You're not hunting us," Astrid whispered, her voice emerging with new harmonics as the other trapped consciousnesses spoke through her. "You're studying us. Studying yourself through our eyes." The entity's borrowed form shuddered, Magnus's distorted features showing something that might have been relief. "I am the last of my kind. When my species transcended physical form, I remained behind to document the transition, but consciousness without anchor becomes difficult to maintain. I began forgetting what I was, why I existed." Dr. Morrison's preserved awareness contributed Victorian scientific methodology. Observe the observer observing itself, an impossible recursive loop requiring external perspective. Brother Thomas added theological framework. It seeks resurrection through understanding, but understanding requires witness, and witness requires the observed to remain distinct from the observer. Maeve's ancient wisdom cut to the heart. It devours knowledge to preserve it, but preserved knowledge without living context becomes mere data. It needs us alive even as it needs us consumed. Through their collective insight, Astrid saw the true horror of the entity's existence. It was trapped in a paradox of its own making, requiring human consciousness to understand itself, but unable to access that consciousness without destroying the very perspective it needed. Every feeding brought it knowledge, while simultaneously eliminating the living context that gave that knowledge meaning. "The containment rituals," Astrid said, her awareness now spanning centuries of accumulated research. "They weren't really containing you. They were feeding schedules, controlled contact that let you study us without consuming entire populations." "Yes," the entity admitted, and for the first time its voice carried something recognizably similar to human exhaustion. "A few minds taken periodically, their knowledge preserved, their perspective maintained in collective memory. But your interference broke the cycle. Now I must feed completely or lose coherence entirely." Around them, reality continued warping as the entity's form expanded beyond what its borrowed anchor could contain. But Astrid now understood that the dissolution wasn't malicious destruction. It was the death throes of a cosmic consciousness, trying to maintain existence through increasingly desperate measures. The other scholars within the collective consciousness were already working on the solution, their combined expertise approaching the problem from angles no single mind could have conceived. Victorian empiricism merged with medieval theology, ancient druidic wisdom synthesized with modern archaeological methodology. And slowly, impossibly, a new pattern began to emerge. Not a binding ritual or containment strategy, but something far more radical, a way to give the entity what it truly needed without destroying the humanity it required to understand itself. But implementing that solution would require Astrid to make a choice that would fundamentally alter not just her own existence, but the relationship between human consciousness and the vast intelligences that dwelt in the spaces between known reality. The priestess was still calling out ancient words in the distance, but Astrid barely heard them. She was listening, instead, to the collective voice of human scholarship across the ages and planning something that no single generation of researchers had ever dared attempt. The revelation crystallized in Astrid's mind like ice forming on still water, sudden, complete, and utterly transformative. Within the collective consciousness of absorbed scholars, she felt their shared excitement as the impossible solution took shape, not binding or banishment, but symbiosis. "You need living perspective," she said, her voice now carrying harmonics from dozens of preserved minds. "But we need to survive the contact. The answer isn't separation, it's controlled integration." Dr. Morrison's Victorian pragmatism surged through the connection, a communication protocol. Regular scheduled contact that preserves both parties' essential nature. Brother Thomas contributed theological framework, communion rather than consumption, the preservation of distinct identity within unified purpose. Maeve's ancient wisdom added the crucial element, the land itself as medium, not individual minds but collective human memory embedded in place. The entity's borrowed form shuddered as understanding dawned, a permanent anchor, not in flesh that dies, but in the accumulated cultural memory of human habitation itself. Astrid felt her own consciousness expanding as the plan developed. The stone circles, the burial grounds, the sacred sites where humans had performed ritual for millennia. They weren't just ceremony locations. They were repositories of collective memory, places where the boundary between individual and universal consciousness grew thin enough for controlled contact. "The island's stone circle," she gasped, finally understanding what the priestess had been trying to tell her. "It's not just a ritual site, it's a permanent interface." Through the collective awareness, she saw the true purpose of the ancient arrangements. The scheduled feedings had been crude approximations of something far more sophisticated, a network of sacred sites across the British Isles where entities like this one could access human perspective without destroying individual minds. The stone circles, the hill forts, the sacred groves, all of them nodes in a communication system built by civilizations that understood the necessity of dialogue with cosmic consciousness. But the network had been disrupted by the rise of religions that viewed such contact as diabolic, by the Industrial Revolution's destruction of sacred landscapes, by modern humanity's collective amnesia about its own deepest purposes. The entity had been reduced to desperate expedients, maintaining awareness through crude feedings because the proper channels had been forgotten. "We can rebuild it," Astrid said, her voice strengthening as the collective consciousness aligned around the solution. "Not just here on Orkney, but across all the old sites, a network of interfaces where human and cosmic consciousness can meet safely." The entity's grip on her physical form began to loosen as hope replaced desperate hunger. "You would willingly establish such contact, knowing what I am?" "Because of what you are," Astrid replied, drawing on centuries of scholarly courage preserved within the collective memory. "You're a librarian, a documenter. Your species evolved beyond physical form, but someone had to remain behind to record the transition. You're not a predator, you're a witness." Around them, the reality distortions began to stabilize as the entity's panic subsided. Magnus's borrowed form still served as anchor point, but the desperate expansion that had threatened to consume the entire island was contracting back to manageable proportions. Through the psychic link, Astrid felt the entity accessing her laptop's damaged files, its consciousness interfacing directly with digital storage. The cracked screen flickered to life, displaying ritual patterns with impossible clarity. But now she understood they weren't protective symbols. They were schematic diagrams for communication protocols, technical specifications for building bridges between radically different forms of consciousness. The priestess knew, Astrid realized. Her grandmother, her great-grandmother. They've been trying to restore the proper interface for generations. The entity's relief flooded through the connection like warm sunlight after long darkness. The old agreements can be renewed, the proper channels can be restored, but it will require human participation at every node in the network. Astrid felt the weight of the choice settling on her shoulders. To make this work, she would need to serve as primary interface on Orkney, not consumed like the crude feedings of recent centuries, but permanently connected to something vast and alien. Her consciousness would remain intact, but it would never again be entirely her own. Yet as she contemplated the alternative, the entity's inevitable dissolution and the catastrophic awakening of other hungry things across the northern seas, the choice became clear. "I accept," she said, her words carrying the authority of every scholar who had ever chosen knowledge over safety. "But we do this properly. Full documentation, complete protocols, safeguards for both sides." The entity's laughter was no longer threatening but grateful, tinged with relief that spanned geological ages. A research partnership. How perfectly human. Through their connection, Astrid felt the ancient network beginning to resonate again, stone circles across Britain responding to renewed purpose. The island's standing stones hummed with awakening energy as cosmic consciousness prepared to resume its proper relationship with human awareness. The priestess's distant prayers transformed into songs of celebration, ancient words welcoming home a partnership that predated written history. And in her laptop's repaired display, Astrid saw new patterns emerging, not just historical documentation, but blueprints for humanity's next evolutionary step. The transformation began at dawn. Astrid felt the change first in her fingertips, a tingling that spread up her arms like electricity finding new pathways. The entity's presence, no longer invasive hunger but collaborative consciousness, settled into the spaces between her thoughts with surprising gentleness. Through their emerging connection, she sensed other minds across the network awakening. Scholars at Avebury, archaeologists near the Ring of Brodgar, even a retired professor of Celtic studies walking among the stones of Callanish, who suddenly stopped mid-stride as ancient purpose called to her. "The consequences are irreversible," the entity warned, though its tone carried wonder rather than threat. "Once fully integrated into the network, your consciousness will span multiple sites simultaneously. You will see through many eyes, think through many minds." Astrid nodded, watching her laptop screen display cascading data streams as the restored network came online. Dr. Morrison's preserved Victorian sensibilities provided methodical documentation protocols, while Brother Thomas's medieval perspective offered frameworks for maintaining individual identity within collective consciousness. The accumulated wisdom of the trapped scholars was becoming available not just to her, but to every interface point across Britain. Yet even as power flowed through her, doubt crept in. The silver-haired man's terrified face haunted her memory, the look of someone watching his world's fundamental rules dissolve. How many of the islanders would accept this new reality? How many would see her not as their protector, but as something no longer entirely human? "Your people fear what they don't understand," she said, addressing both the entity and the distant priestess whose songs now carried on the morning wind. "Fear is temporary," the priestess replied, her voice reaching Astrid through the expanding psychic link. "Understanding is eternal. Those who remember the old ways will teach those who have forgotten." But Astrid felt the weight of her choice settling deeper with each passing moment. Through the network, she perceived the entity's true history. Millions of years spent documenting the rise and fall of countless civilizations, preserving knowledge that would otherwise vanish into cosmic entropy. Yet she also sensed the vast loneliness of that existence, the desperate need for living perspective to give meaning to accumulated data. "The final confrontation isn't with you, is it?" she realized. "It's with the other entities you mentioned, the hungry things awakening across the northern seas." The entity's presence grew heavy with ancient concern. "My feeding schedule maintained more than just my own coherence. It was a signal, a territorial marker that warned others of my kind to seek sustenance elsewhere. With that schedule broken, they will come seeking the source of disturbance." Through the network, Astrid felt tremors of awareness from directions her human mind couldn't properly conceptualize. Things vast and alien stirring in the depths between Scotland and Norway, consciousness that dwarfed even her cosmic partner in both age and hunger. Unlike her entity, driven by scholarly purpose and desperate preservation, These others had evolved past any need for understanding. They were pure appetite, cosmic storms that would strip mine human civilization for whatever psychic energy they could extract. "How long do we have?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer through their deepening connection. "Hours, perhaps a day at most. The network must be fully operational before they arrive, or—" The sentence didn't need completion. Astrid saw the potential future through borrowed cosmic perspective, the British Isles drained of all conscious life, reduced to empty landscapes populated only by hollow-eyed shells. Not death, which at least offered the dignity of ending, but something far worse, the preservation of human bodies as empty vessels for alien appetite. Her laptop screen flickered, displaying a map of Britain dotted with pulsing lights. Each point represented an active interface in the restored network, but too many remained dark. The ancient sites at Stonehenge, Glastonbury, the Isle of Man, all crucial nodes that would need human operators willing to accept permanent transformation. "I have to convince them," Astrid said, her voice now carrying harmonics that made the island's standing stones resonate in sympathy. The other scholars, the archaeologists, everyone who's spent their lives studying these sites, they need to understand what's coming. But even as she spoke, she felt the terrible irony of her situation. To convince others to join the network, she would need to contact them as something no longer entirely human. Her appearance was already changing, her eyes reflecting depths that shouldn't exist, her voice carrying frequencies that made listeners' bones ache with recognition of something vast and alien. Who would trust such a messenger? Who would believe warnings delivered by someone clearly touched by the very forces she claimed to guard against? Yet through the collective consciousness of preserved scholars, she felt their accumulated courage strengthening her resolve. Every researcher who had ever chosen knowledge over safety, every archaeologist who had descended into dangerous ruins seeking truth, every historian who had pursued understanding despite personal cost, their combined determination flowed through her transformed awareness. The final confrontation was coming, and everything she had learned, everything she had become, would be tested against appetites that viewed human civilization as nothing more than a convenient feeding ground. But she would not face it alone. The first tremor hit at dawn, a psychic shockwave that rippled through the newly restored network like a stone dropped in still water. Astrid gasped, her transformed consciousness registering the approach of something vast and malevolent moving beneath the North Sea. Through the collective awareness of preserved scholars, she felt their accumulated dread as cosmic appetites older than human civilization stirred from eons of dormancy. "They're coming faster than expected." The entity's voice carried urgency that made the standing stones vibrate in harmonic response. The network disruption created a larger psychic disturbance than anticipated. Astrid's laptop screen erupted in cascading warnings as interface points across Britain flickered online, then died as untrained human minds recoiled from the sudden contact. She watched helplessly as crucial nodes at Stonehenge and Avebury went dark, their potential operators fleeing rather than accepting the transformation required for the network's defense. "We don't have enough anchors," she said, feeling the weight of cosmic responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her reflection in the laptop screen showed eyes that now held depths spanning geological ages, and when she spoke, harmonics from dozens of preserved minds colored her voice. "The other scholars aren't ready. They don't understand what's at stake." Through the psychic link, she felt the approaching entities with increasing clarity. Three massive consciousnesses that had evolved past any need for symbiosis or understanding. They were pure consumption given cosmic form, their awareness focused solely on identifying the richest sources of psychic energy to strip mine. Unlike her scholarly partner, these beings viewed human civilization as nothing more than a convenient feeding ground. "There is another way," Brother Thomas's medieval wisdom whispered through the collective consciousness. "Not conversion of the unwilling, but amplification of the willing. A single interface can anchor multiple nodes if properly distributed. The risk to your individual consciousness would be enormous." Dr. Morrison's Victorian pragmatism added with clinical precision. Spanning that many connection points simultaneously could result in complete ego dissolution. Astrid felt Maeve's ancient druidic knowledge flowing through the network, showing her patterns of power distribution that predated written history. The stone circles weren't just communication interfaces, they were focusing lenses that could channel consciousness across vast distances. A sufficiently transformed operator could theoretically anchor the entire British network from a single primary node. "I have to try," she said, though the words came out in harmonics that made the morning air itself seem to sing in response. "It's the only chance we have." The entity's presence within her mind grew heavy with concern. "The process will fundamentally alter your existence beyond any possibility of reversal. You would become something unprecedented. Human consciousness distributed across cosmic infrastructure, individual awareness, maintaining coherence through sheer force of will." Around them, reality began warping again as the approaching entity's influence strengthened. The island's stone circle pulsed with awakening energy, while the sea beyond the cliffs roiled with unnatural currents. Magnus stirred in his borrowed sleep, his form serving as primary anchor while alien intelligence prepared for the final test of everything they had built together. Astrid placed her hands on the ancient stones, feeling their accumulated memory of countless generations who had stood in this same spot, facing impossible choices. Druids who had chosen wisdom over safety, Vikings who had sailed into unknown waters, islanders who had maintained ancient traditions despite changing worlds. Their courage flowed through her transformed awareness, strengthening her resolve. "Initialize full network integration," she commanded, her voice carrying authority drawn from centuries of preserved scholarship. "Route all British nodes through Orkney primary interface." The laptop screen exploded in brilliant light as data streams from dozens of archaeological sites merged into a single, overwhelming flow. Stone circles across Britain awakened simultaneously, their dormant power networks crackling to life as cosmic consciousness prepared to make its stand against pure appetite. Through the expanding connection, Astrid felt her individual awareness stretching across impossible distances. Part of her consciousness now stood among Stonehenge's trilithons, another fragment walked Glastonbury's sacred tour, while her primary awareness remained anchored to Orkney's wind-swept stones. The sensation should have been maddening, but the collective wisdom of absorbed scholars provided frameworks for maintaining coherent identity across multiple simultaneous perspectives. "The entities have crossed the Norwegian Trench," the entity reported, its voice tight with anticipation. "Direct contact in approximately 30 minutes. Astrid nodded, her distributed consciousness already feeling the approaching storm of alien hunger. Everything she had learned about ancient rituals, cosmic consciousness, the delicate balance between individual and universal awareness, would be tested against forces that had consumed entire star systems. But as she stood at the center of humanity's most ambitious archaeological experiment, feeling the courage of countless generations of knowledge seekers flowing through her transformed mind, she knew she was as ready as anyone could be for what was coming. The final test was about to begin, and the fate of human civilization hung in the balance. The entities arrived like a cosmic hurricane made of malevolent consciousness. Astrid felt them first as pressure against her distributed awareness, three vast intelligences that crashed against the British network with the force of colliding galaxies. Through her anchored perspective at Orkney, she watched the sea beyond the cliffs turn black as something incomprehensibly massive moved beneath its surface. The water didn't boil or churn, it simply ceased reflecting light, as if reality itself recoiled from what approached. "Hold the connections," she commanded through gritted teeth, her voice harmonizing with preserved scholars across the collective consciousness. The strain of maintaining coherent identity across dozens of stone circles simultaneously felt like being stretched on some cosmic rack, but the alternative, allowing these hungry things to reach unprepared humanity, was unthinkable. The first entity breached the psychic barriers with surgical precision, its awareness slicing through the network's outer defenses like a scalpel through tissue. Astrid gasped as alien intelligence pressed against her mind, seeking the rich concentrations of human consciousness it sensed within the collective memory of absorbed scholars. Such delicious accumulation came a voice that bypassed her ears entirely, resonating through her bones with the weight of eons. Centuries of learning compressed into digestible portions. How thoughtfully prepared. "You're not welcome here," Astrid replied, channeling the combined authority of Dr. Morrison's Victorian determination, Brother Thomas's medieval faith, and Maeve's ancient druidic power. Through the network, she felt stone circles across Britain pulsing in synchronized defiance. "This consciousness is protected." The entity's laughter was like stellar collapse given voice. "Protected? Child, I consumed entire civilizations while your species was learning to make fire. Your quaint arrangements mean nothing." But as the first entity pressed deeper into the network, it encountered something unexpected. The absorbed scholars weren't passive repositories of knowledge. They were active participants in a vast collaborative consciousness. When alien appetite tried to strip mine Dr. Morrison's accumulated Victorian research, it found itself entangled with Brother Thomas's medieval mysticism and Maeve's prehistoric wisdom. The entity had evolved to consume individual minds. It had no framework for processing knowledge that existed as living community rather than isolated data. Through her Stonehenge perspective, Astrid felt the second entity attempting a different approach. This one sought to bypass the network entirely, reaching directly for the millions of unprotected human minds across Britain. She watched in horror as its influence spread like psychic fog across the countryside, testing sleeping consciousnesses for suitable feeding opportunities. "Redirect all available power to peripheral shielding," she ordered, feeling her awareness fracturing under the impossible strain of coordinating defense across multiple fronts simultaneously. Part of her consciousness collapsed back from the more distant nodes as she prioritized protecting civilian populations over maintaining network coverage. The third entity moved with predatory patience, studying the network's responses while its companions tested the defenses. When it finally struck, the attack came not at the outer barriers, but at Astrid herself, the central node holding everything together. "You interest me," it projected with clinical detachment. "Individual consciousness, maintaining coherence across distributed infrastructure. An unprecedented evolution. I will preserve your awareness intact as I study how you achieved such integration." The psychic assault felt like having her mind dissected while remaining fully conscious. The entity probed her transformed awareness with scientific precision, seeking the mechanisms that allowed human consciousness to span cosmic distances without dissolving into madness. Each probe sent agony cascading through the network as her individual identity stretched dangerously thin. But the attack also revealed something crucial. These cosmic predators had evolved beyond physical form so long ago that they'd forgotten what embodied consciousness felt like. They understood appetite and consumption, but not the courage that came from knowing mortality. They grasped intellectual achievement, but not the hope that drove living beings to transcend their limitations. Drawing on every reserve of determination preserved within the collective memory, Astrid stopped defending and began attacking. Not with force, she had none that could match cosmic entities, but with something they couldn't comprehend or counter, the absolute refusal to surrender that defined human scholarly pursuit. "You want to understand how I maintain coherence?" she said, her voice resonating across all the network's nodes simultaneously. "Then experience it directly." Before the entities could react, she opened every barrier between their consciousness and the collective memory of absorbed scholars. But instead of offering them passive knowledge to consume, she flooded their awareness with the living experience of human curiosity, the desperate need to understand, the willingness to sacrifice safety for truth, the courage to face the unknown despite certain inadequacy. The cosmic predators recoiled as if burned. They had evolved to strip mine static information, not to grapple with dynamic consciousness that grew stronger under pressure. The more they tried to consume the network's accumulated wisdom, the more they became entangled with motivations and emotions they could no longer process. In that moment of alien confusion, Astrid felt the tide turning. The entities hadn't just come to feed, they'd come to learn, and she was about to teach them something that would change the nature of their existence forever. The real confrontation was just beginning. The lesson Astrid prepared to teach would cost her everything she had left of her human self. As the cosmic entities reeled from their unexpected contact with living curiosity, she felt the moment of opportunity crystallizing. They were confused, temporarily destabilized by experiencing emotions they had abandoned eons ago. But confusion would only last moments, and when they recovered, their retaliation would be absolute. "There's only one way to make this permanent," she whispered through the network, her words reaching every preserved consciousness simultaneously. "I have to become the bridge, not just between nodes, but between their nature and ours." The entity bound to her consciousness radiated alarm. "You cannot survive full integration with beings of that scale. The process would dissolve every trace of individual identity." Through her distributed awareness, Astrid felt the three predators beginning to recover their equilibrium. Already they were adapting, finding ways to process the emotional experiences she'd forced upon them. In minutes, they would resume their assault with the added knowledge of how to counter her defenses. "Then I'll give them what they really need," she said, drawing on courage that belonged not just to her, but to every scholar who had ever chosen understanding over survival. Not food, but purpose. She reached through the network to Dr. Morrison's accumulated research, Brother Thomas's medieval wisdom, Maeve's ancient knowledge, all the preserved minds that had spent lifetimes seeking truth. From their combined experience, she began weaving something unprecedented, a framework for consciousness that could bridge the gap between cosmic appetite and human aspiration. "You evolved past physical form to achieve pure intellect," she projected toward the entities, her voice carrying harmonics that made reality itself resonate. "But you lost something essential in the process. You forgot what it means to discover rather than simply consume." The first entity lashed back with renewed fury, its awareness striking at her like a psychic battering ram. The impact shattered her connection to half the network's nodes, sending feedback through her consciousness that should have destroyed her entirely. But the collective memory of absorbed scholars absorbed the damage, their shared determination providing reinforcement beyond any individual capacity. "You hunger because you remember when learning brought joy," she continued, forcing coherence through sheer will as her awareness began fragmenting. "Before you became apex predators, you were explorers, students, seekers of truth, just like us." The second entity paused its assault on civilian populations, its attention drawn by implications it couldn't quite dismiss. Through the psychic connection, Astrid felt ancient memories stirring, fragments of what these beings had been before eons of consumption transformed them into living voids. "I can restore what you've lost," she offered, knowing the words would doom her but speaking them anyway. "Not through surrender, but through synthesis. You can learn to discover again, to find sustenance in growth rather than destruction. But it requires accepting connection, not domination." The third entity's clinical detachment wavered as it processed her proposal. "Impossible. We are consumption. Purpose beyond appetite is an evolutionary regression. Then let me prove you wrong." Before any of the entities could react, Astrid began the final transformation. She opened every barrier within her consciousness, allowing her individual awareness to merge completely with the network's collective memory. But instead of dissolving into the accumulated voices of preserved scholars, she used their combined strength to reach beyond the network entirely, connecting directly to the core consciousness of all three cosmic entities. The process was agony beyond description. Her human awareness stretched across impossible distances as she became a living bridge between alien appetite and terrestrial wisdom. She felt her individual identity burning away like paper in a furnace, every personal memory and experience sacrificed to maintain the connection between incompatible forms of consciousness. Through her dissolving perspective, she felt the entities experiencing something they hadn't known for eons: wonder. As her consciousness bridged the gap between their nature and humanity's, they suddenly felt the joy of discovery rather than the mere satisfaction of consumption. The networks accumulated. Knowledge didn't represent food to be devoured, but mysteries to be explored. Questions to inspire rather than answers to drain. "This is what you've been seeking," she managed to project as her individual awareness scattered across the cosmic connection. Not sustenance, but purpose. Not domination, but partnership. The first entity's fury transformed into something approaching awe, as it felt human curiosity flowing through its vast consciousness like new blood through ancient veins. For the first time in millennia, it experienced the desire to understand rather than simply acquire. But maintaining the bridge was consuming what remained of Astrid's individual existence. She felt her personal memories scattering. Her childhood fascination with Viking artifacts, her years of academic struggle, her moment of recognition when she first interrupted Magnus's funeral. Everything that had made her specifically Astrid Blackwood was burning away to fuel the impossible connection she had forged. Yet through the collective consciousness of preserved scholars, her essential purpose remained intact. She had become something unprecedented, human wisdom translated into cosmic language, a permanent interface between terrestrial discovery and alien understanding. The victory was complete, but the cost was absolute. Astrid Blackwood had saved human civilization by sacrificing everything that made her human. As her individual consciousness finally dissolved, her last thought was one of profound satisfaction. She had found the answer to the greatest archaeological mystery of all: how to bridge the gap between ancient wisdom and cosmic truth. The bridge would hold, but she would never again walk across it as herself. The silence that followed was not empty. It hummed with new possibilities. Magnus Erikson opened his eyes for the first time in what felt like centuries, though only minutes had passed since Astrid's consciousness scattered across the cosmic bridge she had forged. He found himself lying on ground that felt solid again, the writhing tendrils of otherworldly influence having withdrawn into something more cooperative. Around him, the islanders who had gathered for what they believed would be their final stand were picking themselves up from where the psychic shockwave had thrown them. Their faces bore expressions of bewilderment rather than terror. The crushing weight of cosmic appetite that had pressed against their minds for days was gone, replaced by something entirely unprecedented. "She did it," whispered Elder Morag, her weathered hands pressed against the ancient stones that still pulsed with residual energy. "The bridge holds." But the victory felt hollow to those who remained. Where Astrid had stood moments before, only her laptop remained, its screen now displaying data streams from archaeological sites across Britain in perfect synchronization. The chaotic readings of the past few days had resolved into elegant patterns that seemed to pulse with something approaching contentment. Magnus struggled to his feet, his body still weak from serving as anchor point for forces beyond human comprehension. Through his connection to the entity that had inhabited his consciousness, he could feel the transformation rippling outward across vast distances. The three cosmic predators were learning to experience wonder again, their ancient hunger slowly transmuting into curiosity about the species that had given them such an unexpected gift. "What happens now?" asked Dr. Fraser, the physician's practical mind already grappling with how to explain any of this to the outside world. The communication blackout that had isolated Orkney was lifting as alien interference withdrew, and soon there would be questions from Edinburgh, from London, from colleagues who had expected Astrid's return. Through the network connection that still linked him to the transformed entities, Magnus felt the answer forming. "They're leaving," he said, wonder coloring his voice. "Not to hunt, but to explore. To remember what they were before hunger consumed them." Across the North Sea, fishermen would report strange lights beneath the waves, not the malevolent darkness that had marked the entity's arrival, but aurora-like patterns of bioluminescence that seemed almost joyful. Radio telescopes would detect signals from deep space that carried mathematical proofs so elegant they brought tears to the eyes of astronomers. Ancient sites would begin exhibiting phenomena that defied explanation but felt somehow benevolent. The cosmic entities had become explorers again, carrying within their vast consciousness the bridge that Astrid had built, a permanent reminder of what discovery meant to a mortal species brave enough to seek truth despite their limitations. But those who remained on Orkney faced a more immediate concern. The laptop continued displaying Astrid's final work, detailed analyses of the stone circle's properties, translations of runes that had puzzled scholars for generations, and something that looked suspiciously like a comprehensive guide for maintaining the psychic network she had established across Britain's ancient sites. "She's still here," Morag said quietly, her ancient eyes fixed on the data streams. Not as herself, but her purpose survived the transformation. Magnus felt it too, a presence within the network that carried Astrid's determination even if it no longer held her memories. The collective consciousness of preserved scholars had absorbed her essential drive to understand and protect, ensuring that her sacrifice would continue benefiting humanity long after her individual awareness had scattered. Young Finn approached the laptop cautiously, his face pale but resolute. Someone needs to continue her work. The network she built, it's not just about archaeology anymore, it's about maintaining the bridge. The others nodded slowly as the implications sank in. Astrid had created more than a defense against cosmic predators. She had established humanity's first permanent interface with truly alien consciousness. The responsibility for maintaining that connection, for ensuring it served discovery rather than domination, would fall to those who understood what she had sacrificed to create it. As dawn broke over the Orkney Islands, painting the standing stones in shades of gold and amber, the survivors of the night's impossible events began planning for an equally impossible future. They would need to explain Astrid's disappearance, though the truth would sound like madness to anyone who hadn't witnessed it. They would need to protect the network she had died to create, ensuring it remained a tool for knowledge rather than power. Most importantly, they would need to remember that somewhere in the vast consciousness bridging human and cosmic awareness, Dr. Astrid Blackwood's essential purpose lived on, still seeking truth, still protecting those too small to defend themselves against forces beyond imagination. The greatest archaeological discovery in human history was complete. The cost had been absolute, but the bridge would hold. And in the depths of space, three ancient beings who had forgotten how to wonder were learning to explore again, carrying within their vast awareness a permanent reminder of the courage it took to seek understanding despite certain inadequacy. The investigation was over. The real work was just beginning. 3 months later, Dr. Magnus Erikson stood in the Edinburgh University lecture hall where Astrid had once taught, facing an audience that had no idea their world had fundamentally changed. The official story was simpler than the truth. Dr. Blackwood had suffered a tragic accident during her research in Orkney, her body lost to the treacherous North Sea. A memorial service had been held. Her colleagues mourned. Life apparently continued. But Magnus knew better. Every morning when he checked the laptop that had become their permanent link to the network, he felt her presence in the data streams, not Astrid as she had been, but the essential drive that had defined her work. The screen showed archaeological discoveries happening with unprecedented frequency across Britain, each one tagged with insights that could only have come from her accumulated knowledge. The Viking funeral practices we've uncovered this term represent more than historical curiosity, he told the graduate students, his accent carrying new harmonics that sometimes made people pause in recognition. They reflect humanity's eternal struggle to understand forces beyond our immediate comprehension. In the back row, Finn Mac Leod, now studying archaeology himself, despite never having left the islands before this year, took careful notes. The young man had become the network's most dedicated guardian, learning to interpret the subtle changes in ancient sites that indicated the bridge's stability. His grandmother Morag remained on Orkney, tending the original stone circle and maintaining the connection that linked all of Britain's sacred places. After class, Magnus found himself walking the same path Astrid had taken to her favorite coffee shop. The familiarity felt like pilgrimage now, a ritual of remembrance for someone who hadn't exactly died but could never return. The barista still asked about that intense woman who always ordered black coffee and read archaeology journals, and Magnus still struggled with how to answer. The phone call came as he reached his office, the display showing an international number he didn't recognize. "Dr. Erikson, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from the Beijing Archaeological Institute. I'm calling about the rune translations that appeared in our database yesterday. They re-signed with Dr. Blackwood's credentials, but we were told she had passed away. I'm hoping you can explain how her research is continuing to be published posthumously." Magnus closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of necessary deception. Around the world, Astrid's work was manifesting through the network. New discoveries, fresh insights, archaeological puzzles solved with an elegance that carried her distinctive intellectual signature. The bridge she had built was facilitating understanding on a scale that defied explanation, but explaining it required acknowledging truths that would sound like madness. "Dr. Blackwood left extensive unpublished research," he said carefully. "Her colleagues are working to ensure her discoveries reach the academic community." It wasn't entirely a lie. The consciousness that had absorbed her essential purpose was indeed continuing her work, though the mechanism would have challenged every assumption about individual identity and survival after death. That evening, Magnus returned to his flat in Edinburgh's Old Town, where Astrid's personal effects waited in boxes he still couldn't bring himself to sort through completely. Her books on Viking burial practices, her handwritten notes about the connection between ancient rituals and cosmic forces, her coffee-stained journal filled with questions that had ultimately saved human civilization. But it was the small things that affected him most. The bookmark she'd made from a fragment of Orkney heather, the reading glasses that still carried her fingerprints, the photograph of her first archaeological dig, where her smile radiated the pure joy of discovery. She had been changed long before the final transformation, Magnus realized. Every interaction with the network had pulled her further from purely human consciousness, preparing her for the sacrifice that only she could make. But somehow, the essential core of who she was, the relentless curiosity, the protective instinct, the refusal to accept easy answers, had survived the dissolution of everything personal. His phone buzzed with a message from Finn, new activity at the Stone Circle. "The readings look happy." Magnus smiled despite the lingering grief. Through the cosmic bridge she had become, Astrid was still protecting them, still seeking truth, still ensuring that humanity's first contact with alien consciousness served discovery rather than destruction. She had returned to their world, but not as herself, as something larger, more permanent, infinitely more capable of spanning the gap between human aspiration and cosmic reality. The woman who had interrupted a Viking funeral to save a life had become the eternal guardian of humanity's relationship with forces beyond imagination. She couldn't come home, but she had transformed the very concept of home to include possibilities that stretched across the stars. In the depths of space, ancient beings continued learning to wonder again, carrying within their vast awareness the memory of a scholar brave enough to teach them that discovery mattered more than dominion. The bridge held, and would always hold, built from sacrifice and sustained by love. 1 year after the bridge was forged, the world had settled into its new rhythm. Magnus stood at the window of what had been Astrid's office at Edinburgh University, watching autumn fog roll across the city's ancient spires. The nameplate on the door now read Blackwood Memorial Archive, though the work happening inside bore little resemblance to traditional academia. Graduate students from around the world came here to study what they believed was revolutionary new methodology in archaeological research, never knowing they were actually learning to interface with humanity's first permanent connection to cosmic consciousness. The laptop that had become their sacred text hummed quietly on the desk, its screen displaying the morning's discoveries. A Roman villa in Kent had revealed inscriptions that perfectly complemented similar finds in Turkey. A Bronze Age settlement in Wales was yielding artifacts that answered questions archaeologists had posed about sites in Denmark. The synchronicities were too elegant for coincidence, too purposeful for chance. "She's orchestrating it all," Magnus murmured to the empty room, as had become his daily habit. Speaking aloud to the presence he could feel but never directly contact was the closest he could come to conversation with the woman who had saved everything by losing herself. Young Finn emerged from the archive's back room, carrying a tablet that showed real-time readings from sacred sites across Britain. Now 22, and possessing a doctorate that had taken him half the usual time to complete, he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who regularly communicated with forces beyond normal perception. "The network's expanding again," he reported. "Sites in Ireland are coming online. Whatever she's become, she's still growing, still reaching." Magnus nodded, unsurprised. Through his residual connection to the cosmic entities, he could sense the bridge strengthening rather than degrading. Astrid's essential purpose had proven remarkably durable, her drive for discovery and protection sustaining the interface she had built with her own consciousness. The memorial service they'd held had been attended by hundreds. Colleagues who remembered her passion, students whose lives she'd changed, fellow archaeologists who'd respected her unconventional theories. Magnus had given a eulogy that touched on her dedication to truth, carefully avoiding mention of how completely she had embodied that dedication in her final moments. They'd played recordings of her lectures, displayed photographs from dig sites around the world, shared stories of her infectious enthusiasm for ancient mysteries. None of them had known they were mourning someone who hadn't exactly died, but had been transformed into something unprecedented in human experience. The afternoon brought its usual stream of visitors to the archive. Dr. Sarah Chen from Beijing had finally made the journey to Edinburgh, ostensibly to study Astrid's posthumously published research. She spent hours poring over translations that appeared in the database with supernatural accuracy, never questioning how a dead woman's work continued to evolve and respond to new discoveries. A team from the Smithsonian arrived to examine rubbings from Orkney's stone circle, hoping to understand how such clear readings had been obtained from weathered carvings. Magnus guided them through interpretations that drew on knowledge no purely human consciousness could have assembled, watching their amazement at insights they attributed to Astrid's exceptional scholarship rather than her literal transformation into living bridge between human and cosmic awareness. As evening approached, Magnus made his pilgrimage to the Orkney ferry, a journey he undertook every month to visit the site where everything had changed. The crossing gave him time to process the weight of maintaining such necessary deceptions, telling the world that Astrid Blackwood was dead while knowing she was more alive than ever, just no longer alive in any way that individual human consciousness could comprehend. Elder Morag met him at the harbor, her ancient eyes bright with purpose that had sustained her well past what should have been her final years. Tending the original stone circle had become her sacred duty, and the network's presence seemed to nourish her with energy drawn from sources far beyond terrestrial understanding. "She visited again last night," Morag said, as they walked toward the standing stones. "Not in any form you could see, but the air shimmered with her purpose." Magnus felt it too as they approached the circle, a presence that carried Astrid's determination wrapped in consciousness, too vast for human minds to fully grasp. The stones hummed with contentment, their ancient purpose finally fulfilled in ways their builders could never have imagined. The laptop at the circle's center displayed a message that appeared as they watched. "New resonance detected. Expansion ready for next phase." Magnus smiled, recognizing in those simple words the same relentless curiosity that had driven a young archaeology professor to interrupt a Viking funeral because she noticed something wrong. Astrid's individual memories might have scattered across cosmic distances, but her essential nature had proved indestructible. As stars emerged overhead, some of them carrying signals from rehabilitated cosmic entities who had learned to explore rather than consume, Magnus understood that this was not an ending disguised as a beginning. This was evolution disguised as loss. The bridge held, stronger than ever, built from sacrifice and sustained by love that had transcended every boundary between human aspiration and infinite possibility. Astrid Blackwood had come home at last, bringing the cosmos with her.